That's right, yeah. Thanks very much. It's great to be here. Sorry I missed the morning. It sounds like it was a great session. I was at another meeting, so I just managed to get here today. But I'm really looking forward to the afternoon and spending some time with some old friends and new this evening and tomorrow as well. So for those of you I haven't met yet, I'm a biologist. I'm based in British Columbia. I work as a private consultant there with a series of other researchers, and I also work for governments, industry, Aboriginal communities, environmental organizations, you name it. And most of the work I do is on large mammals in Canada's north on a variety of different topics, so I'm going to be talking about that today. I gave a bit of a, I can't advance the slide that way, here we go. So I gave a bit of a preview of this talk last year on what I was going to talk about this year, and so I'm keeping my promise. And the situation I want to talk about is monitoring, yeah, that's right, monitoring wildlife populations using remote wildlife cameras. So there's a camera right there that's nailed on a tree. And so what we have are these cameras that we put out in the wilderness in this kind of grid arrangement. And what we're really trying to figure out is we take pictures of wildlife as they walk by. And our goal here is to understand how habitat and snow conditions interact in order to partition the landscape amongst different species. And one of the reasons that we're interested in this, one of the primary reasons, is the species that we're concerned with in this area for the most part is caribou. And caribou is an endangered species, and one of the big problems is that they get eaten a lot by wolves, and that makes everybody sad. So we're trying to reduce that. I mean, it's natural that wolves eat caribou, but there's things that we're doing that are affecting that interaction, and that's what I'm going to be talking about. So this study design was originally put together by a company out of Edmonton called Matrix Solutions, and so I'm really thankful for them for sharing the data and allowing me to do this analysis. So a little more detail on these cameras. This is what they look like. So they have just a standard motion sensor in the front, and then they have a sensor, a photo sensor basically that can take visual light pictures and also infrared, so they work at night as well. So, and then the whole thing is in this waterproof enclosure, and you just nail it to a tree, and the animals walk by, you get their picture, it's stored on a standard SD card, and you can leave them out there for about a year in the bush. So they operate a very long time. And the nice thing is that they're completely non-invasive, so you don't have to capture the animals. So you don't have to jump out of helicopters to capture the animals. All you do is this boring study where you nail these things to the trees and just collect the data for a year or so, and then you can download them. So a little more detail on the study area. This is what the country looks like. This is in northeast British Columbia, so right at near the Alberta border and right up by the Northwest Territories, which is about the 60th parallel. And this country is dominated by these kind of upland areas with these mixed conifer and deciduous forests, and then these lowland areas with lots of bogs and lakes and that sort of thing. It's more or less a fairly pristine environment, but there has been a lot of oil and gas activity in that area. And the oil and gas activity leaves a lot of these seismic lines, so you can see one kind of running through here. And if you know anything, I don't know if any of you work in the oil and gas industry, but a seismic line, basically, they cut these lines in the forest, and then they take these machines and they basically thump the ground, and then they measure the return of the sound waves off the various structures below the surface, and that's how they figure out where the oil and gas is. So at least that's how I understand it, but that's generally how it works. So they put a lot of these cut lines in, and those cut lines are really slow to recover because they don't, because these are very, very low productivity environments. The summers are obviously very short, and the winters are very long, and as a result, they don't grow back very quickly. So this is an example of this is where we had a grid of our cameras, and just like to point out that since BayesiaLab 7, I've been able to use BayesiaLab itself to actually do some of the mapping right inside the application, which has really been handy for people like me who deal with a lot of spatial data. So this is, a Google Earth underlying this, obviously. And so we have spatially referenced the location of our 85 cameras. This is the little city of Fort Nelson here. If any of you have ever been up the Alaska Highway at all, the Alaska Highway runs actually right up through Fort Nelson and goes out this way before you go on for another 1,600 or 1,700, maybe 2,000 kilometers before you get to Alaska. So it's a long way, but it's sort of near the beginning of the Alaska Highway. Okay, as I said, just bringing it back to what the study that we're talking about is how do we use the intersection of habitat, snow conditions to explain the distribution of animals according to these cameras where we collect data from. And so the first thing that I wanted to talk about is what we do around the habitat data. So with the habitat data, what we do is we get some very poorly paid grad students, and we give them a lot of bear spray, and then we drop them in the middle of the wilderness, and they go out and stand in front of these cameras and they measure a lot of habitat variables. And it can get very hot and sunny there, and like I said, lots of bear spray. And they measure a number of different attributes of the habitat. So just the list of variables that we collect, so canopy cover, canopy height, a whole bunch of variables that are related to the composition of different trees, percent cover, that sort of thing, shrub layers, graminoids, grasses, and a few specific species. But of course, this isn't very useful for characterizing habitat because there's too many variables. So what we want to do is characterize this in a simpler way so that we can convey what the habitat is like in front of these various cameras. And so for that, we need some sort of variable reduction technique. And so what we do is we do latent factor analysis in BayesiaLab. So for those of you who have taken the introductory course or read the white paper, this is like the perfume example, only less French. And what we do is, for this, we did basically an unsupervised learning on all the variables to develop this network. A number of the variables fall out, but a number of variables are retained in the network. And then we do variable clustering, and that's what's reflected in the colors here. And so it clusters up fairly nicely, and then we do multiple clustering to break these out into the constituent models for each of the clusters. And it works out quite nicely. So in this first one that comes out with our first factor, it's basically explaining our tree layer. So it's explained by slope, canopy height, and the composition of some different trees. So we have these environments that are dominated by these black spruce trees. And then in this other environment, we have these white spruce trees. Although, I mean, they're both kind of green. I don't know why one's black and one's white, because you'd never know it by looking at them. And then there's some aspen in there as well, which is the deciduous tree without any leaves on it, obviously, in the winter. So it falls out in these nice two habitat types. And then the remaining three variables are related to the composition, of other layers. So we have a shrub model here at the top with all of our shrub layers, and also vaccinium, so that's huckleberries, so wild blueberries. Bears really like those. So bear spray when you're dealing with places with lots of vaccinium. And the moss layer, and also the lichen layer. And so the lichens are quite important because that's what caribou really like to eat. And I do have a little video, Stephanie, although I think I've shown this one before, but I just want to catch the beginning of this. I just want to catch the beginning of this video. Come on. Turn that off. How can I advance the video? I guess I have to do it manually, do I? Oh, there we go. Sorry, I want to just, right there. Oh, come on. Okay, I'm just going to let it run. So there's an actual camera on the collar of this caribou, so you can see how it's hanging out in its environment. The beginning of the clip had a picture of it with a clump of lichen in its mouth, so I just wanted to catch that. So it's with this newborn calf. I think that might be some afterbirth or something. Oh, and here comes the wolf, so stay away from the wolves. And then they go running away. It's perfect. So these are the collars that we hang on the caribou, and this particular model of collar has a forward-facing camera, so that thing is just hanging under his neck and facing forward, so you can get very good shots of what it's eating and how it's. And another important thing is how long it actually keeps its calf before it dies. That's one of the things we can tell from the data. Okay, back to the study. So the next thing we want to do is we want to characterize animal use. And so I said this is one of the photos from the cameras that we got. As I said, they have infrared sensors, so we can get these nighttime photos. So this is the majestic moose, of course. And so this is the next step for underpaid grad students, because what they have to do is they have to go through all the photos. And they have to look at every one of the photos and figure out what animals there are on each of the photos. And there's a complication here because sometimes the animals kind of hang out in front of the camera, so you might get multiple exposures of the same animal. So we need to correct for that, obviously. We also want them to characterize what the snow conditions are like as well. So how deep the snow is, whether it's packed or not, is one of the important factors. And then another complication is, of course, if it's windy or something, we might have the trees rustling, and then that triggers the cameras. So there's a lot of blank photos on there that you have to go through. So you get literally hundreds of thousands of photos that we have to go through. So just for the interest of everybody here, so you know what all these species are, this is your biology lesson. This is the moose, elk. This is a black bear with an itchy back. And yeah, he used that tree a lot. And then this is a snowshoe hare, white in the winter, brown in the summer. This, believe it or not, are bison, so buffalo. And you might be surprised that there's actually bison. We usually think of bison as something that was eliminated along with passenger pigeons and Native Americans from the American Midwest. But actually, there is that's the plains bison. There's actually a woodland bison that roams up in this area, and there are native herds. Although we found out after some digging around that those aren't actually native bison. There was a bison farm up there, and it went out of business, and they just released all their bison. And these bison have been living in this caribou range this is probably the descendants, 2 or 3 generations of bison who have been living in this area. Grizzly bears, so that's a big grizzly bear right there. Wolverine, nasty little animal, they're always in a hurry. White-tailed deer, right at the very northern extent of their range. This is a Canada lynx, beaver, a little baby wolf pup, and a caribou. So pretty typical of all of the species that we get on these cameras. In terms of the frequency that we get more caribou on the cameras than anything else, and then black bear, moose, and wolves, but you'll notice we also get a lot of people. The reason we get a lot of people is because of the snowmobiling. So as I said, that we cut these seismic lines, and in the summer you can't really walk on them because it's very spongy, mossy ground, but in the winter it freezes up, it snows, and it turns into a real playground for the snowmobilers. So we caught a lot of snowmobilers on all our cameras going back and forth. So it was our second most common species out there were humans. And that turns out to be quite important. So in the next step, we've gone through the process of characterizing all our habitat data, doing our latent factor analysis. We have our characterization of trees, shrubs, moss, and lichen. So we know generally what the habitat is like in front of those cameras. And next we want to analyze the observations. And so for this approach, this is a supervised learning approach using augmented naive Bayes with our species observations as our target node. And then we use our latent factors, the tree, shrub, moss, and lichen models, and our snow condition data as our predictors. And then we modeled our 4 most common species separately. So we have 4 separate models, one for caribou, moose, wolves, and caribou. Did I say caribou twice? Bear, right. And I also mentioned, of course, that we have these very skewed data sets. So for our caribou, really, out of all of our observations, only 1.3% of the observations had a caribou. 1.3% of our photos had a caribou in front of them. So it's important to stratify our data set so we don't overfit it to the non-observations, basically. So I won't go through the models in detail, but this is kind of how they start, this is how they come up. The critical thing for the caribou is that they really like hanging out in these black spruce bogs, so they like that particular habitat type. This is very typical of the kind of place that they're found in. They're in this little boggy habitat. They don't like really being up on the upland areas. And that turns out to be quite different than the moose. They're not nearly as interested in hanging out in that kind of habitat. So they're up where there's a lot more deciduous browse and that sort of thing. The bear model has one fewer nodes than the others because when there's snow on the ground, they go to sleep. So there's no winter effect for bears because they sleep right through the season. It's a very long season, so they sleep a long time. And then finally for our wolves. Now I mentioned one of the things that we were really interested in was the effect of snow, and particularly snow packing. And so if we look across our three species, moose, caribou, this one's got a radio collar on it actually, moose, caribou, and wolves, and then we look at the situation where we have unpacked snow, so we're setting evidence on our snow condition node. This is observational evidence, these are not causal models. Basically, the probability that we have one of those species in front of those cameras in that unpacked snow condition is pretty much the same right across. When we set evidence on the packed conditions, then we get some different things happening. So for moose, the probability that we observe a moose on one of those cameras under packed snow conditions actually goes down. So it seems like they tend to be avoiding these packed features. But when we move on to the caribou, their use actually goes up, 36% to 50%. So their use of these packed features actually goes up. And then if we go over here to the wolves, they really, really like packed features. So they go from 36% up to nearly 84%. So as soon as you pack a feature, those wolves are on it like crazy. So a very simple mechanism for that is the fact that moose have really long legs, and caribou have medium legs, and wolves have really short legs. And believe it or not, that's kind of the way it works. So moose don't really care. The snow has to get really deep before it slows down a moose, because a moose at its shoulder will be taller than me, and so their legs are probably this tall. So that a little bit of snow isn't going to bother them. They don't care if it's packed or not. But caribou are much smaller. So a caribou, even its head might stand only about this high, and its back, kind of like one of those miniature ponies. They're sort of that size. So they have much shorter legs, a little more bothered by deep snow. And of course, wolves are just big dogs, and they really like to avoid that deep snow. And so you can see the mechanism starting to set up here, where the moose don't really care, but the caribou kind of get attracted to those packed features, and then the wolves really get attracted to those packed features, and then the wolves kill the caribou, and everybody's unhappy. And so that's kind of what's happening in this. So the question is, what's causing all the packed features? And what's causing all the packed features are the snowmobiles. So it's the snowmobiles that are coming out on these lines, and they're packing these features, and those features are attracting the wolves. The wolves are walking down the line, and they're encountering caribou, and the caribou are dying. So this kind of very indirect, through this indirect means, we have this elevated rate of predation on caribou as a result of the snowmobiling. So that's what we're trying to control. So the really cool thing is we can go back to BayesiaLab, and we can actually represent this visually. And so what I've done here is I've themed up those camera locations with a couple of variables. And the first variable is the size of the circle. So the size of the circle is related to the probability that that camera location is caribou habitat. So what I did is I took my camera data and I ran it through all the species model as an evidence scenario file, and that gives me the probability of each one of those cameras serving as habitat for that particular species. So the bigger the circle, the more likely it is to be caribou habitat. But secondarily, I also colored it according to the probability that point is also wolf habitat. So if it's low wolf habitat, it's green, moderate, yellow. If it's high wolf habitat, then it's red. So basically, the caribou don't want to be where the red dots are. And so on the left-hand side, this is the situation with packed snow conditions. So you can actually see the biggest green dots. They're actually green, they're not red. So caribou are a little smarter than I thought. They seem to be going to places where the wolves kind of stay away. But you see there's quite a bit of red there on the medium size. So those are the places that are the most dangerous for caribou to be. Those are the kinds of places that we need to be concerned about the snowmobiling effect. And you can see the total effect of that packed condition when you move from packed snow on the left-hand side to unpacked snow on the right-hand side. And you'll notice how much greener that situation is, because in effect it's become worse wolf habitat because those features are no longer packed. So we've been able to demonstrate visually the relationship of the landscape to both wolves and caribou, and then estimate what the benefit would be if we actually removed the snowmobiling from the landscape. So that's about all I wanted to cover today. Just to summarize, a couple of steps, a lot like the perfume example, latent factor analysis to characterize our habitat in front of the model, in front of each one of those cameras, a bit of latent factor analysis to reduce the number of variables down to something that's quite reasonable and understandable, and then using the animal data to relate that to the snow conditions, which allowed us finally to not only estimate but also to map the changes in the risk that would result from removing those snowmobiles from the land base. That's it.